Okay, let's get this party started. CIF24-2. We're at it again with more information about the history of the Western civilization from the period 84 to 94. And particularly here, we're dealing with sociopolitical history as opposed to the cultural history that I was covering previously. In this period, one of the most important developments is related to the Soviets, the battle between the communist regimes and the capitalist regimes in the world, and the resolution of that battle with the collapse of the Soviet regime in the period from 1989 to 1991, essentially. So what we're going to talk about here is a comparison at the very start of that collapse between the two different forms of protest response between the USSR and the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in this period. And we're going to look at two specific events for that. In 1989, these things both happen within quite close range of each other. On the 15th of April to the 4th of June, we have the Tiananmen Square protests. These protests are essentially democratic protests, the results of accumulations of students coming together and complaining about the existing regime. They are unfortunately most famous to this day for the event that ends them on the 4th of June, which is the Tiananmen Square Massacre. To this day, this event is a matter of, shall we say, debate between mainland China and most of the rest of the world. The extent to which thousands of people died in this horrifying moment, or in mainland China, a protest was relatively peacefully disrupted. These two narratives obviously can't exist in the same reality with each other very comfortably, but that's something that everybody just has to figure out and resolve on their own. A very politicized issue, so one I'm not really comfortable diving that much deeper into right here. Moving on very quickly, 1989, this protest is seen in the West as ending in this horrible massacre. And so from our Western perspective, we compare it to an event that we know occurs in the West on the 19th of August, and which we call the Pan-European Picnic. Here's where the different narratives of the Tiananmen Square Massacre suddenly become really important. If you see the Tiananmen Square Massacre as this huge violent event where thousands of people died, which is the narrative that I've seen very convincing information to support, then the Pan-European Picnic is this really interesting contrast. This is essentially this moment where the border between Hungary, which is in the USSR, and Austria, which is not, is opened for a very brief moment so that people can just get together, hang out, and not be destroyed by the Soviets. And the fact that the Soviet Union doesn't show up and mow everybody down with tanks or shoot people is taken as indicative of the fact that it's no longer that interested in maintaining what has been known up to that point as the Iron Curtain, right? It's not interested in keeping its sort of boundary states perfectly sealed off from the rest of the world. And that's a really radical change in policy. Such a radical change that it's the prelude for the entire collapse, for the dissolution of the USSR. The dissolution of the USSR. This is a crazy moment in history, to say the least. In 1989, on the 9th of November, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. This sets the stage for the reunification of Germany. The Berlin Wall was, of course, the dividing structure between, and a symbolic dividing structure as well, between East and West Germany. East Germany, of course, had stayed under control of the Soviets and had produced its own semi-independent, perhaps not Soviet republic. Meanwhile, Western Germany had, of course, been incorporated into the capitalist countries through a number of interesting initiatives, most famously something called the Marshall Plan, which involved vast deposits of wealth. Though now, is the Marshall Plan the specific name for the Japanese infusion of wealth, or does it cover the Western Plan that is occurring at roughly the same time? I'm not sure about that. You should double check. I am not going to, though, however, because I gotta move on. Sorry, get weighed down. Fall of the Berlin Wall, 9th of November. 1990, May 12th. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Latvia and Estonia reaffirm the Baltic Entente. So these are Baltic states, obviously. The Baltic Entente is kind of funny. So this is signed originally on the 12th of September in 1934, and it's basically a combined agreement between these two countries that they're going to struggle together against the USSR. I forget exactly how it breaks down, but it's very much a document signed sort of in anticipation and against the invasion of the USSR. That sort of invasion then, of course, occurs, however you want to call it, and then the Baltic Entente obviously is meaningless, right? So the reaffirmation of this particular piece of legislation is a callback to a time before the Soviets. They're very specifically saying, hang on a minute, we're going to remobilize this piece of legislation that symbolizes that we don't wish to be under Soviet control anymore, right? That's the entire purpose and point as far as I understand it. This is followed up a month later with two really important events that occur on the same day. That's June 12th. The first one is the referendum across the entire Soviet Union of the Soviet referendum. What? Gonna need to do that or something. The Soviet referendum on the equal rights of sovereign republics. What is this intended to mean? This is essentially a reaffirmation of one of the basic socialist ideals that causes a lot of problems for the USSR, which is its support for independent nationalistic identities and sort of sovereign rights. Or not. This becomes a big asterisk because obviously when lots of countries are at least seen as wanting to be socialist, there's a big incentive to support this, but when socialism becomes much less popular because of obvious awful things that happened, there's much less support, right? So this reaffirmation of the rights of the sovereign republics is again a very active push against the USSR as a whole, or at least it's seen that way. The same day, June 12th, in Russia, we have a really important referendum. Oh, sorry. 78%. Yes. So it passes. I was just talking as though it had passed, but obviously it does in fact pass. June 12th in Russia. On the same day, a referendum on whether Russia should have a president. This passes and becomes quite significant and introduces one of our sort of most popular characters into the story. 1990, on the 3rd of October, West and East Germany are officially reunited. West and East Germany are officially reunited. The resulting state is, of course, called the Republic of Germany. So this is kind of a remarkable process, and a process that 10 years ago certainly people were just had pretty much given up hope on, as far as I'm aware. So really amazing transformations are happening in a really short amount of time. In 1991, on June 12th, a year after the referendum on whether Russia should have a president, its new president is elected, Boris Yeltsin. Elected president of Russia. This role at this point, who knows how powerful it's going to be? We're about to find out. The president of Russia is ultimately, of course, going to replace the leader of the USSR as the most important political position in the region of countries now known as the USSR. Yeah, or sorry, that used to be known as the USSR. This is where states fall apart. Language gets a little complicated sometimes. Forgive me. So President Boris Yeltsin is elected. He's going to continue to play an important role in our story. 1991. August 19th, the actual Soviet leader of the time is, of course, a guy named Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is about to take a temporary departure of the scene. Communist hardliners. They really want the Communist Party to stick around. Communist hardliners try to seize control of the government by basically imprisoning Gorbachev in his home and then trying to use the military to gain control of the state. Gorbachev in his holiday home and are starting a military takeover. This does not work. Basically, this guy, Mr. Boris Yeltsin, is much more popular than the guys who are imprisoning Gorbachev, and frankly, much more popular than Gorbachev himself. Mr. Yeltsin gets up on a tank, gives a famous speech where basically he says, actually, the military is with me. And it turns out that he's right. And when the military is with you, you usually have a pretty good advantage. Gorbachev is quietly released, and the coup dies away. And something happens to the people. I forget. I'm sorry. It ends up not being a major military transition, and they don't gain control of the state. Gorbachev is, however, seen to be powerless is a bit strong, but not strong, not a powerful leader. And Boris Yeltsin's emergence onto the scene in this moment and his ability to rally the military under his leadership is seen as just a really obvious transition point in where Russian leadership is. So this is a super important moment. The reason that the communist hardliners are after Gorbachev is because of, and I'm going to mess up this pronunciation, glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost and perestroika are essentially these westernization, these themes of westernization that Gorbachev is attempting to do to the economy and also to the political system in Russia to some extent, or at the very least, he very much wants to be seen as doing that. August 19th, December 1st. Here we have a quick rush of dates as we head towards the end. On December 1st, Ukraine votes to leave the USSR. Ukraine votes to leave the USSR. This is significant for a number of reasons. Obviously, has modern significance, but Ukraine is just the biggest part of Russia, part of the USSR outside of Russia. So that's obviously really important. Immediately after it, December 8th. On December 8th, Yeltsin and the Ukrainian president meet, and they make a funny declaration. And president declare the USSR is over. A couple days later, Gorbachev makes a public announcement. Gorbachev is, shockingly enough, upset to discover that the USSR is over. He may not actually be aware of it at the time. He blames the CIS. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Sorry, he doesn't blame the CIS yet. It's a little later on. Getting ahead of myself. December 21st. I'm trying to get this all on one, but I never do. I never manage it. December 21st. The CIS is established. I knew I was ahead of myself. Commonwealth of Independent States. What is this? This is independent states. This is essentially a like League of Nations, a radically toned down version of the USSR. It's a replacement. It's a Western style replacement for the USSR, which is kind of crazy to think about. Replacement for the USSR. So at this point, on the 21st, the sovereign rights of the individual nations have been established. The hardliners inside the communist government supporting the USSR have tried to gain control and failed. And all of the major states involved in the USSR, including Russia, have all declared that they are going to be part of this new Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. The USSR is on shaky ground, if it's on any ground whatsoever at this stage. And shockingly enough, I'm really disappointed I managed to get this all into one page. Just how it goes, I guess. Scoot you over just a tiny bit there. That seems to switch to 1999? Oh my gosh. I got carried away. I don't know how I did that. I'm sorry, guys. Somebody's been screaming at me for like 5 minutes about that. 10 other people just clicked off the video. They're like, no, this guy's an idiot. Can't tell the difference between a 9 and a 1. 1981. Getting it right. Double checking. Triple checking. CIS established. That was all good. Gorbachev resigns. And that happens on December 25th. Of course, Christmas Day. For us, not for them. Gorbachev resigns. Definitely some symbology there. Hands over power to Yeltsin. Blames the CIS. All right, that's CIS. And last but not least, on the 31st, the Soviet flag descends from the Kremlin. And there we go. That's our ultra-fast run-through of one of the most important events in history. The collapse of the USSR is remarkable for a number of reasons. It's considered to be remarkable because of how peaceful it was for the size and number of people in the state. It's considered remarkable for how fast it occurs. the extent to which, one of the things that has been brought into question later on is the extent to which an old state was actually replaced with a new state. For a short period, of course, people were very optimistic about what the new Russia would do. At this point, I think it's safe to say that that optimistic has faded by quite a large amount. Sad but true. So at this stage, we'll get to all that exciting stuff later. The USSR and Russia as a whole is suddenly going to take a backseat in many of our stories for the next decade or so, and then re-emerge in shocking style. Moving on to our next major story, the Gulf War. It's crazy but true. Prelude to the Gulf War. So the Gulf War is another huge event, and part of the reason we have to cover the Gulf War is because the Gulf War is an essential storyline to know in relation to the later American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and just in order to understand American foreign intervention as a whole, this is a really important conflict to have in your brain. So, prelude to the Gulf War. How did the Gulf War get triggered off? What started it? I think this is a pretty good way to sum it up. Unless Kuwait gives us $10 billion, we will invade. So says Iraq. Kuwait offers 500 million, but that's not enough, and Iraq will, of course, invade. On August the 1st, 1990, you see it's all happening in the same sort of time frame here, the Iraqis walk out of talks. Talks with the Kuwaitis. What have the Iraqis and the Kuwaitis been talking about? The Iraqis and the Kuwaitis have been talking about oil. The Iraqis basically are blaming the Kuwaitis for keeping the oil price too low through OPEC, and because the Iraqis are blaming the Kuwaitis for keeping the oil price too low, this means that they think that they are losing lots and lots of money on the oil that Iraq is selling. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq at the time, is then claiming that this is essentially a form of economic warfare. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Regardless, he's going to use this as a pretext to invade Kuwait, which is something that I and the rest of the international community at the time disagreed with quite strongly. The Iraqis walk out of talks with the Kuwaitis on August 1st, and that is followed by me not being able to find absolutely anything. August 2nd, there it is. I've switched colors for the dates, I'll take that. I've also inverted my dates. I'm sorry, guys. I've used multiple different date conventions in my notes. It's terrible. It's bad. I shouldn't do that. Now I've erased this and I'm silly, but I'll make it into a tank or something. There we go. Perfection. Okay, so now that looks cool. Let's switch my date format to the proper one. 1990, August 2nd. Special Forces. Land on the beaches, and tanks roll into Kuwait. The Emir, the leader of Kuwait, and his bodyguard escape. Saddam controls, by some estimates, a fifth of the world's oil, which is an insane amount of oil. H.W. Bush, the American president at the time, has a lot to say about this, and this is one of his favorite words: Hitler revisited. He brings up Hitler a lot in relation to Saddam Hussein. I'm not sure this is the right choice, but yeah. That's what he goes for. He launches a really savage international campaign. Wait, does it say HW? HW. Oh my gosh. Sorry. Wait. Now sorry, I'm mixing up my bushes. Which is a hilarious thing to say. No, it is HW. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. For a moment I thought they lost a letter as time went by? That's just not fair. Sorry. Yeah, ignore my panic. It is H.W. Bush. Moving on. So, Saddam controls a fifth of the world order. HW is on the TV all the time saying, this guy's awful, he's the worst, he's just like Hitler. One of the other things he's doing is he goes and he meets... Do I not have a date for this? Whatever. He meets Gorbachev and asks him not to intervene. Gorbachev, interestingly enough, probably has no intention of intervening at the time, but he says basically just try to find a peaceful resolution. Try to find a peaceful resolution. That's what Gorbachev strikes back with. We know, of course, that part of the reason for this is because Gorbachev is really busy. Right? He's not dealing with this problem right now. He has bigger issues on his plate. Ask him not to intervene. Tries to find a peaceful resolution. All good stuff. Okay. Let's cover some basic Canadian aspects of this. That's why my dates work out the way they do. 1990 on August 10th, the CIF. Got to throw in my Canadian stuff for a moment. The Canadian Armed Forces launches Operation Friction. Operation Friction. This is the name for their participation in this war. And on 1990, October 8th, Canada, 18 Canadian jets arrive in the Middle East. This information is pulled from a document written by Canada. Much of the information in this comes from several different books and sources, but one of the primary sources for this certain section of lectures, though much reduced here than what you get if you go and watch it, is the set of lectures on YouTube, on the Yale channel, by Ian Shapiro on Power and Politics. Good stuff, far more detail than I want to cover, but these topics are covered back and forth and upside down, back to front, and from a very different political perspective than mine. Enjoy if that you want vastly more detail or reinforcing evidence for much of what I'm saying. That being said, this Canadian section is definitely not from there, because he doesn't give much love to Canada. 18 Canadian jets arrive in the Middle East. And note, this is the first conflict women serve in a combat role for Canada. So this is a nice sort of measure of the of women's rights. I don't know why it was so hard for me to get there, but yeah, do we let women fight? What do we let women do in comparison to men? That's one of the standard ways to measure women's rights. The final total will be about 4,000 CAF members. Not women, but just CAF members overall. Fight. The Gulf War. Let's hit it. So, a few hours before the UN deadline, Saddam goes on TV. He's defiant. He says, the Americans and the British can never win. He's actually a little stronger than that, but can never win. He's making interestingly enough, he's making sort of like a technical argument. He thinks that basically American technology has sort of separated them from their military people and their military roots. They're insulated by technology, and therefore they don't know how to fight properly. They can't actually fight real wars anymore. This turns out not to be how war works. I'm sorry. Technology is incredibly important in war. Obviously. The Americans and the British can never win. 1991. January 15th. Last year of the Soviet Union. Deadline passes. HW signs order for war. He's been drumming up support, strong rhetoric, gets support, gets his war. Interestingly enough, it's not going to help him win an election, though it will spike his popularity incredibly high. 1991, January 17th, Operation Desert Storm. That's the name for the American part of the military operation that's about to take place. It starts with 2 months of airstrikes. Basically, the Americans are just going to deploy airstrikes on anything that they think is a military target, and especially anything they think has a Saddam Hussein hiding inside of it. This is a very effective campaign. It terrorizes the Iraqis. There's been great debate about the extent to which it was or was not having running up a high death toll on the civilian population. The arguments are heavily complicated by the lack of good data, which is very explainable because, of course, Saddam Hussein's government is not keeping particularly good records, and there's lots of good reasons why whatever records they have, unfortunately, are perhaps not kept in very good shape in the future from where we are right now. So, unfortunately, we just don't know quite as much about I did a bunch of research into this at one point, into how many people died in this operation. It seems like overall, this was a relatively bloodless affair for a war. Though, to be honest, that seems to be mostly due to the duration of the ground offensive and the air offensive, both of which are quite short compared to other major conflicts. Right. We'll come back to that. Moving on. January 17th is the official launch of Desert Strike. 1991, by February 13th, something awful has happened. The Amiria bunker is hit. This causes the deaths of a number of civilians. Again, a hard number to track down, but this seems to be a reliable estimate. Civilians die. It is unfortunately, it is being used as an air raid shelter, just for civilians. It had previously been used as a military location. The Americans still had it on a list. They hit it anyway. They specifically hit it with a bunker busting weapon because it was designed to resist an air raid strike. But shockingly enough, the American military technology was successful, and it busted right through that bunker and killed a whole bunch of innocent people. Horrible, and really, if you're looking into civilian casualties in this conflict, this is the top incident to research. So, moving on. Not that anything is going to be that cheerful. 500,000 coalition troops will eventually amass on the border. Saudi Arabia is, of course, directly south of this encounter. You can think of this like... There you go. Sort of like that. with Saudi Arabia down here being the sort of staging ground for all of the different coalition forces, with Kuwait, forgive me, over there, and Iraq, of course, over here, having invaded. The actual attack by the American military will take two fronts. They'll attack directly into Kuwait and directly into Iraq, with the plan being to sort of sandwich Kuwait, and the assumption being that the Kuwait-based Iraqi troops will be more intensely focused in Kuwait, and they'll like hold out longer. So the American troops will incur into here and then fight a two-fronted battle against the Iraqis in Kuwait. Right, so classic pincer move. In reality, the Americans hit relatively little resistance compared to what they're expecting, and by the time they essentially make their way into the country like this, and then like this at basically the same speed, and then they meet up together in the middle. And there is a pincer element, but the war is so quickly won that it's hard to say it was even remotely a factor. All right, 500,000 coalition troops. Eventually, we're almost there at the actual conflict. On the 21st, 1991, February 21st, Iraq refuses a UN resolution to end the war. They go through a weird sort of dance where they're like, we're going to refuse the resolution, but we also really don't want to fight. The Americans at this point are tired, and a vast amount of money has been put in motion to get this war off the ground, and unfortunately, it isn't going to be stopped. On February 27th, the Gulf War enters its final day. It will ultimately only be a 100-hour war. Kind of crazy. The reason for that is essentially that American forces, the air campaign previously seems to shatter Iraqi morale. The Iraqis really have very little interest in fighting to defend Kuwait on a man-to-man basis. Desertion is a huge issue as American invasion looms closer and closer and closer. And all of these problems ultimately just combined to make it a very quick, very easy affair for a very dominant enemy against an opponent who really doesn't want to fight that much. So the Gulf War is important historically for a number of reasons, and we'll look into them right now. Yeah. I'm actually kind of enjoying doing this thing. I don't know. Let's see if the aesthetic is one that I like afterwards, but stacking it up. Okay. Stop moving my camera around. Don't touch that thing. Okay. Let's look at some outcomes of the Gulf War quickly. I don't want to get bogged down in this, but it is good to sort of recap why this is important. Basically, the media looks good. An 100-hour war is a crazy thing. Like, seriously, an 100-hour war? The Americans essentially conquered Iraq in 100 hours. It wasn't quite that, but really, if they wanted to take control of the country, they were a stone's throw from doing so, based on the things that I've read. Second, international support through the UN. This really was a war that everyone was on the American side for. Or almost everyone. To a remarkable degree. The most important part of this international coalition is, of course, the local Middle Eastern partners. Right? Without their backing, none of this is possible. Right? Without Saudi Arabia to take 500,000 coalition troops, none of this happens. Paid for. Even better, those coalition partners they footed the bill, including to a large percentage the Middle Eastern ones. Do I have it written down? I don't have the numbers on the cost written down, but I believe the Americans pay something like 10% of the end cost for this, if not even less, which is obviously pretty good. You know, you win a big war on the international stage, and you don't even have to foot the overall cost for it. Popularizes U.S. foreign intervention. Popularizes U.S. foreign intervention. HW will not win re-election, but it will spike his popularity through the roof for a short period, and future U.S. foreign interventions will be quite popular for quite a long time. And it takes, in fact, another, the previous conflict that burned people out was, of course, Vietnam. And it takes another really painful, long conflict, or multiple, but arguably we could say Afghanistan is the larger one. Afghanistan to make U.S. foreign intervention unpopular today. So depressingly, this has been kind of like a 30-year cycle or something, or maybe a 40-year cycle, or something like that, of a U.S. intervention waning and waxing in popularity. Those are the overall important takeaways. This is, of course, a theme that will continue to be a really important part of our Western history. The next major event that we have to talk about, I'm going to do again as quickly as I possibly can, is the South African transition. These three events are connected ultimately by the fact that they're all incredibly important and they're all occurring at the same time, and they're all having really radical impacts on the way that we perceive our Western democracies. There are even some continuous characters, but forgive me for the amount of bouncing around that we have to do to get this coverage down. On 1990, back in 1990, weighed down by that year, February 2nd, de Klerk unbans the opposition. Specifically, of course, the ANC, and announces negotiations. This is, of course, also with the ANC. African National Congress. This is a huge and significant moment, obviously. The African National Congress is representing the black majority in South Africa that has previously been manipulated in an apartheid structured state to provide the economic and financial backing for a white minority to maintain control and access to privileges, luxury, and education. This system was not sustainable for all sorts of obvious reasons, the simplest being that the minority white elite, in order to maintain and consolidate its control, it needed to have enough white people to actually run and control all the different organizations needed to police all of the different subsections of black society, in addition to all the needs of white society. These civil demands ended up being just absurd. It's just doesn't, like, you just can't use a minority to entirely police a majority of your state, which makes total sense if you think about it for a second. And so inevitably this led to the education of a group of black people in the state to then, in theory, take control of other black people and institutions that controlled the movement and powers of black people in the state. The fact that this, this did not continue when put in those terms, I think makes a ton of sense. But of course, at the time period, there was no way people could see forwards. And one of the things that I think is so important about this story is that we see all of the tremendous challenges that present themselves to stopping a change, even if everybody, or a vast majority of the people in that state, even those in power, agree that a change is necessary and should happen. And I think the South African transition is a great example of that. You know, the majority of the people agree that there needs to be black representation. It's just obvious it's part of the future. But how the heck do we get there? That's the story that we're going to talk about. It turns out that the answer is top secret negotiation, which is a little sad for fans of democracy. But there you are. 1990, on the 7th of August. On August the 7th, the ANC declares an end to struggle with the government. So this is a reciprocating action. Negotiations are going well, is the message being sent out here. 1991, April 30th, the indemnity and prisoner release scheduled to end. It's just release of political prisoners. (1991) December 21st, we have CODESA 1. CODESA 1. This is an acronym I struggle with. Convention for a Democratic South Africa. There are several of these meetings. Democratic South Africa. There's at least 2 CODESAs and a multinational party negotiating forum, something like that, and then at least one other one as well. And these are all attempts by different political parties in South Africa to come together: white nationalist, black, Zulu nationalist, and hash out what the future is going to hold for their country, and how they're going to get to this election that they're going to, in theory, take part in. There's, of course, these discussions are really sort of dominated by, on one side, the white parties, on the other side, the ANC, but other major minority parties come forward and assert themselves, the most prominent of which is the Inkatha Freedom Party, the Zulu Nationalist Party, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA 1, is a roundtable discussion, essentially, and there's 19 political parties involved. The problems of this are immediately apparent to, like, everybody. 19 different political parties in the same room together. You can imagine the just straight pandemonium that this would inspire. So, convention, we've got CODESA occurring in 1991. Then, of course, 1991, March 17th, we have the whites-only referendum. The whites-only referendum was a thingy where stuff happened. The whites-only referendum is something I'm totally blanking on. It's such a provocative name. It's like blown all the other ideas right. Oh, I blanked on it last time too. Do you support the continuation of the reform process that the state president started on the 2nd February 1990, which is aimed at a new constitution through negotiation? Whew. Do you support de Klerk's reforms that he started here, the chats with the African National Congress? That's all it is. But it only applies to whites. Whites only referendum. A 68.7% say yes. Support de Klerk's reforms. This is seen as a pretty convincing mandate by the white population that there needs to be change, though I must admit 68.7% is kind of a sad number. I would really, that number should be a bit higher, I would hope. There is there are some people here who are voting against this referendum, not because they don't want eventual changes to the society that include more black people, but simply because they disagree with de Klerk's particular vision of how that's going to occur. But that I don't think ends up playing a major role in matters here. 1991, sorry, did I say 99? 92, that's my first 92 date. I didn't mess anything else up, I promise. Don't hurt me. 1992, March 17th. 1992, we got another one here. Oh my god, it's a second Cadessa. Cadessa 2. They tried it again. So, after unsuccessfully getting anywhere by having everybody sit down and talk about it, they realize that there's nothing else they can do other than sit down and have everybody talk about it, so they go back to the table. What are they arguing about in Cadessa? They're trying to figure out what the interim government should look like and when and how the elections should go off. Because black people basically haven't been incorporated into this state structure, this democratic state structure or pseudo-democratic state structure, there's just, there's whole new sections of the population that need to know where their polling stations are, right? It's kind of crazy. Cadessa number 2. This is Cyril Ramaphosa and Tertius Delport, hashing it out. Basically here, there's again, failure for consensus, right? We can't agree on what's going to happen in the future. 1992, June 17th. Boy Patong massacre, horrifying massacre. It triggers the collapse of negotiations. Basically, horrifying violence either accelerates or breaks up the democratic attempts. The Boy Patong massacre itself, I'm going to look at it in a little bit more detail here. Yeah, I thought it was an Inkatha Freedom Party, but I didn't want to get it wrong. IKP, the Inkatha Freedom Party. Inkatha Freedom Party. These are the Zulu nationalists. And they kill 45 people in Boy Patong. Kill 45 in Boy Patong. The ANC publicly blames the white government, the National Party in this case, I believe, for collaborating with the police to prevent these. To try to not prevent these murders from occurring. The extent to which this was or wasn't the case is very complicated because, of course, the white police are obviously not doing a fantastic job of keeping black South Africans safe, to say the absolute least. Sorry, I'm still slugging here, but this is a long one. We're gonna get there. June 17th. 1992, Boy Patong massacre. Also in 1992. 26th of September. The National Party and the ANC sign a record of understanding. So this is them sort of privately a plan for an interim government. Basically, the government and the ANC is going to perform all of the functional negotiations during this period, unfortunately, or all of the really functional ones. The public negotiations end up being really important, but mostly for sort of like appearances and for how they're able to judge sort of the public moment, at least as best as I understand it. Oh man, we're almost there. Let's do this. 1993, April 1st. This is the multi-party negotiating forum. Multi-party negotiating forum. This is again another attempt, just like the Codesas. It is very promptly interrupted on April 10th when Chris Hani is shot. And he is a prominent South African ANC member and communist. Killed by an anti-communist guy, Dutch immigrant, I think. Leader. And his killing basically triggers the ANC to go to the government and say, hey, you are going to call an election or else. And it takes a couple of weeks for the government to figure out that's what the ANC is saying to it. But on the 26th, de Klerk announces an election 1 year from that day. Elections are to be held in 1 year. These are essentially attempts to stave off the Civil War, right? This is horrifying. The ANC is incredibly upset, or at least its membership is, and they're ready to go to war over this. Violence is horrible and keeps occurring during this stage, during these years. I'm only covering the more major incidents, and we're going to see in just a moment one last big attempt to start a civil war. De Klerk announces the elections are to be held in exactly 1 year. That sets off a timeline, and the other political actors start reacting relatively quickly. In June, Mangosuthu Buthelezi died a couple years back. Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He walks out of negotiations. This is important because the Zulu nationalists are the third biggest party. And so losing that essential, the third element, now you're only holding your election of your two biggest parties. The perception of a legitimate democratic election is something that really matters here, and this is something that jeopardizes it, or at least could be seen as jeopardizing it. On June 15th, however, there's a much more active attempt to jeopardize the process. When Afrikaner Weerstandenbeweging, I believe it is. Somebody help me with that. If you're listening to this, thank you so much. Unless I get it wrong. Weerstandenbeweging. The AKB, these AWB, these are basically they're Nazis. They're Nazis. I don't know, like they're Nazis. They dress in clothing that makes them look like Nazis. Their white nationalist beliefs, it's close enough. What do they do here? They storm the World Trade Center in South Africa. Storm the World Trade Center, which is where the negotiations are taking place, and they try to shut them down. They are, of course, resisted, and everything turns out okay for the people who are negotiating, but it's a crazy moment, and there's some great video there of this attack going down. Really, really insane stuff. 1993, do I have enough room for this? Yes, I'll do one more, I think, on this page. 1993, we have one more horrible event, unfortunately, to talk about. Oh no, I lied. 1994. March 11th here. We have the random killing of 42 by AWB. Random killing of 42 in a small black village called Bofuthatswana, I believe. Bofuthatswana. This is just horrible, right? It's purposefully intended at starting some sort of civil war in order to derail the peace process that they see now as the peace process, to derail the election, which will hopefully eventually lead to peace between these two groups. All right, slugging forth, Bofuthatswana, terrible, sad. One big thing that helps the election on its way is in 1994, on the 20th of April, 7 days, 1 week before it's about to fire, the Inkatha Freedom Party abandons its boycott. So they actually do run, and they will actually get voted for, and they do actually come in third, all of which is pretty impressive for people who weren't even supposed to be running. April 27th, as promised, the election occurs. And as expected based on the polls, the results are a government for Nelson Mandela with 62% of the vote. A F.W. de Klerk scoops up 20%. And the third party is, of course, the Inkatha Freedom Party with Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Taking home 11%. As you can see, 62, 82, 93%. By definition, those are those have to be the three most dominant forces. A Mangosuthu Buthelezi just passed. F.W. de Klerk, as far as I'm aware, is quite well remembered, and obviously Nelson Mandela will set an impressive precedent in the ANC by stepping down and allowing somebody else to take charge. One of the great debates about South Africa to this day is the extent to which it qualifies as a democratic country, essentially because of the fact that it's only been ruled by the ANC since this period. Since 1994, the ANC has been the government in charge, though the actual leader has changed over time. Maybe we will see a new leader in the not too distant future. Things keep looking like they might happen that way in South Africa, but not yet. So, the last thing that I think I'm going to cover, this note is too fat. Someday I have to figure out how to hash it down. It's sad, but it's true. The last thing I want to cover is I want to do a quick overview of the political theory of the 1980s. Political theory in 84 to 94. Close enough. So, to make a long story short, in 1989, people are pretty excited. Proponents of Western democracy are pretty excited. All three of the events we've talked about are seen as big victories for liberal democracy. For liberal democracy. In the case of the South African transition, obviously, we're seeing this really remarkable moment whereby a country is becoming more democratic, right? This is seen as a good thing for the other democratic countries. We have another friend who is more democratic. South Africa itself had been causing a lot of trouble for the other democracies simply by being so egalitarian and obviously against basic human rights in an era where Western democracies were trying to invent themselves as being for human rights. So this resolution of start at least of some major resolution to this really big issue in South Africa plays into this narrative of things getting better. The obvious really big one, though, is the USSR's collapse. The USSR's collapse warps Western politics, because it has warped the existence of Western politics while it's been around. Essentially, while the USSR is around, there's a big stick that exists in politics for North Americans, for Europeans. You can always say, well, if you don't play nice with me as a left-wing party, then I'm going to get more and more left-wing, and eventually I'll get so left-wing that I start asking the Soviets for money, and then we've got to deal with communists in our country, and that would be really bad. You don't want that. You got to be careful about that. So all of that stuff plays a really important role as a big stick, even if a lot of the time those leftist organizations don't actually intend to carry it through. There's a number of different explanations for this as well, but the reality of the situation is definitely that left-wing politics has to reinvent itself after the USSR goes away. Right? The USSR, as long as it exists, plays a really prominent role in what people understand left-wing politics to be. We're still sort of suffering with that vacuum to this day. So, the USSR's collapse warps Western politics. What else did I want to talk about here? There's two really important books that are published in this time. Francis Fukuyama, The End of History and the Last Man. Do I have it within reach? Here, I'll go grab a couple. Ugh. Oh. Okay. I gotta. Right, this is way more active. Sorry, wrong. This is way more activity than I'd expected. So, straight up there we have The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama. This is one of the more important books to read from this time period. End of History and the Last Man. This is because Fukuyama is doing a number of things, but basically he's announcing the liberal democracy is the best and last political system. Best and last political system. If you are familiar with the works of Hegel, well, so is Fukuyama, and he's very much trying to apply a Hegelian end of history to liberal democracy. I'm not sure how Hegelians feel about this. As somebody who's read a bit of Hegel, it seems like a stretch to me, but hey, if you guys like it, then you do you. The other really important book to talk about from this era, the one that's sitting on my lap, is Samuel Huntington. These guys are both, to make a long story short, Clash of Civilizations, feeding into something that we call neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has become the dominant economic platform, essentially, of the West. For better or for worse, it is what it is. So Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. This one is a little more long-winded in some ways. It is more about how civilization has changed and progressed over time in some periods that I actually not show it to you. Here it is. Ta-da! Huge and beautiful. Enjoy. It's about sort of how these things have how am I going to hold it? Probably like that. How things have changed and progressed in for the world in democracy. He's conceiving of these different waves and moments in democracy, and he's imagining again this future where the sort of technological, social, and political advances of democracy have led to a change that makes basically never-ending economic growth, the utopia of never-ending economic growth possible. And sure, there are a few downsides to the way that our states are and they exist right now, but they will be solved if we just stick to this prescribed economic and political plan. There's obvious criticisms, but this is still a very dominant ideology and a very dominant set of ideas. Let's talk about exactly what neoliberalism sort of entails, what these guys are advocating, since they're working so hard to declare that this is the best economic platform. We should actually try and talk about what that economic platform is. Am I going to do the... Just keep doing this thingy? Why not? Perfection. So, I'm going to do it in like 10 minutes because I'm getting real tired. Neoliberalism consists essentially of three factors: globalism, deregulation, and privatization. And you can find that in these books. You can find it in a couple other places. Globalism, deregulation, and privatization. Let me briefly describe what's going on here. With globalism, we basically have free trade and movement, especially of goods and capital, across borders. I'm not using the dollar sign idly there, that's for sure. Deregulation. What's deregulation? And it's just the getting rid of regulations. This is the reduction of government rules and oversights. Specifically on corporations, it turns out, so one of the many criticisms that emerges later out is it turns out that, of course, larger organizations tend to be easier to regulate than smaller ones because they have a lot of money, so they can pay to be regulated. When we try to regulate small institutions, we have a problem where we can't just force them to pay for their own regulation, because often small businesses just can't afford to do that. And even if they could afford to do that, we would then need to pay for a process by which we could double check that they were actually doing their homework, and that would be incredibly expensive to go through and check every single small business. And we try to do some very lame version of it, but we really, really don't do it. Sorry, I got distracted for a moment. This set of deregulation is then mostly aimed at corporate deregulation, and specifically financial. A lot of neoliberal deregulation was aimed at deregulating the financial industry, and also to some extent deregulating military regulation. But let's not talk about that right now. Privatization, our third part of neoliberalism, of course, goes hand in hand with deregulation. Not only do we want to remove the fetters from these private corporations in theory so they can create more economic growth, but we also want to just make more of them. So this is both a reduction in government services as opposed to rules, but it's also support for business. And again, for similar reasons to a small business oversight and the challenges that faces, when we start giving support to businesses, it tends to be easier to regulate and keep track of the support that we give to big businesses. And it tends to be much cheaper to distribute a few smaller, large packages to larger businesses than it is to distribute a very large number of very small packages to all the different small businesses. If it's hard for me to be positive about neoliberalism, it's because we've existed with the consequences of neoliberalism for many years. And one of the reasons these two books are so important is because they laid out an agenda and a future for neoliberalism by which you can read and test to see if they were right. And I suggest that you do that. You should read these books to see if these guys were right about what neoliberalism promises, because that really matters in a context where neoliberalism continues to be one of the most important dominant economic structures that you have to worry about in modern day. So as foreign policy, it's important that you know that neoliberalism, especially as it's pushed forward by the IMF, becomes known as something called the Washington Consensus. But much more importantly, there's two flagship neoliberals. And it is, of course, 1 and 2. Ronald Reagan, that's funny, and Margaret Maggie Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher. Ronald, of course, is in charge from 1981 to 1989. And Margaret Thatcher is around from 1979 to 1990. It's safe to say these are two of the most controversial political leaders of the last 40 years in the West. Especially in terms of how polarizing they are. People really love Ronald Reagan. They really love Margaret Thatcher. People really hate Ronald Reagan. They really hate Margaret Thatcher. This is basically because of how different groups of people see their role in revitalizing the economy. This legacy is long, complicated, and difficult, and much clouded by the fact that in the early 90s, right after they leave office, there's a recession. And some people would blame that recession on the fact that these people left office, and other people would blame the recession on the fact that these people were in office to begin with. Many years later, their individual programs have been sort of, what their individual programs were is of course very important, but these aspects of their individual programs have been recognized very clearly, were recognized at the time, and they are still, and they're seen really as sort of resembling this transition moment, especially in the UK, where the Labour Party, which is the rival party to Margaret Thatcher, essentially abandons a non-neoliberal platform in favor of a neoliberal platform because of Thatcher's influence. Incredibly influential in politics, and neoliberalism to this day is the economic platform that we have to concern ourselves with. And it very much warps and distorts modern politics and conceptions of politics. And to this day, if you've heard of, cuts are good, a small government, no taxes, no taxation. Except these days it's usually just like, don't tread on me or something. These are all things that you notice actually fit quite well into neoliberal platforms, despite independently being represented by different parts of the political spectrum. So this is really why neoliberalism ends up being so pervasive. It sort of sets the boundary conditions for modern economic discussions on the way states should engage with their economies. That's basically this period in a nutshell. Neoliberalism is emerging as the dominant economic theory during this period of 84 to 94, and because of the massive successes that the liberal democracies see during this period, there's a lot of people who attribute them directly to neoliberalism, and thus, neoliberalism is put forward as not only the model for us in the West as the method going forwards, but for future countries as well. Unfortunately, in the 30 years hence, not to spoil things too much, this doesn't work out quite as well planned, and this moment of American hegemony that we're catapulting ourselves into it ends remarkably quickly and gives way into something that we now think of as a bizarre sort of multipolar economic military world. That's finally it for this one. I got to figure out how to get the Canada stuff in here at some point, but this video is way too long, and I'm tired. I want to go drink some water and do something else with my life. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you split this into like 2 watches or something, or you're like driving to Madagascar. Have a great day. Thank you so much for being here. Love yourself, love the people around you, and learn as much as you can, because it really is. That's why we're here.